October 1942, Rechlin Experimental Airfield, Germany. Oberst Adolf Galland stood before the captured Boeing B-17 flying fortress, his expression grave as he ran his hand along the bomber's aluminum skin, still scarred from the combat that had brought it down over France. Through the plexiglass nose, he could see the bombardier's compartment, the navigator's station, and the maze of cables and equipment that filled every available space. Behind him, Field Marshal Erhard Milch waited impatiently for the assessment, his face betraying the anxiety that none of them dared speak aloud. This was the first B-17 the Wehrmacht had captured intact enough for proper examination. Everything German intelligence believed about American bomber capabilities was about to be challenged. Galland turned to face the assembled officers, his voice measured but carrying a weight that silenced the room. It unites every possible advantage in one bomber. Firstly, heavy armor. Secondly, enormous altitude. Thirdly, colossal defensive armament. And fourthly, great speed. The words hung in the morning air like a death sentence. Milch knew what this meant. He had already told the Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that he disagreed with the assessment that American four-engine bombers posed no significant threat. Now, standing before this technological marvel that represented American industrial capacity, made manifest in aluminum and steel, those concerns crystallized into certainty. Within months, formations of these fortresses would fill German skies, and despite everything German fighter pilots had learned in 3 years of war, despite all their experience and skill, they were unprepared for what the B-17's defensive firepower would do to them. The transformation from theoretical threat to existential crisis began 6 months earlier, in April 1942, when the Boeing Company in Seattle, Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, and Vega in Burbank hit their production stride. The factories operated around the clock, 3 shifts of workers, many of them women who had never set foot in an aircraft plant before Pearl Harbor, now riveting aluminum skin to frames with precision that would have been unthinkable in German manufacturing philosophy. The B-17F model, rolling off the production lines that spring carried 9 Browning M2 machine guns of half-inch caliber, positioned throughout the airframe to provide overlapping fields of fire. 2 flexible guns in the nose, operated by the navigator and bombardier, 1 in a dorsal turret behind the cockpit, manned by the flight engineer. 2 waist guns, 1 port and 1 starboard, in open windows along the fuselage midsection. 1 in a ventral ball turret suspended beneath the fuselage. 2 in the tail position, defending against rear attacks. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute, sending projectiles downrange at 2,850 feet per second. At effective range, estimated at 400 to 600 yards by American trainers, these weapons could tear through the relatively light structure of German fighters. The bomber carried over 7,000 rounds of ammunition distributed among the gun positions, enough for sustained defensive action throughout a mission that might last 6 or 8 hours from takeoff to landing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But numbers on paper told only part of the story. The real question facing Wehrmacht planners in late 1942 was not how many guns the bomber carried, but whether those guns could be used effectively in actual combat conditions. German intelligence analysts remained skeptical. Defensive gunnery from moving platforms against high-speed targets had proven notoriously difficult throughout aviation history. Hit rates, even under ideal training conditions, rarely exceeded 5%. In actual combat, with fighters attacking from multiple directions, simultaneously, with the bomber maneuvering to evade flak, with wounded crew members calling for aid, with engines failing and fires breaking out, effective defensive fire seemed like a theoretical possibility rather than a practical reality. The Germans had reason for confidence. Their fighter pilots were the finest in the world in late 1942. Many had flown in the Spanish Civil War in 1936. They had fought over Poland, France, Britain, and now deep into the Soviet Union. Some aces had accumulated victory totals exceeding 100 aircraft destroyed. They flew Messerschmitt Bf-109S and Focke-Wulf FW-190S that could outperform any Allied fighter in most flight regimes. Their tactics, developed through years of combat, emphasized aggressive attacks from optimal angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire while maximizing their own hitting power. When the first B-17 formations began appearing over occupied Europe in August 1942, German fighter units approached them with the same tactics they had used successfully against British bombers. Attacks from behind, where the bomber's relative speed was lowest, and the fighter pilot had more time to aim and fire. The results were catastrophic for the Germans. The B-17's tail position, enclosed in a powered Cheyenne turret with excellent visibility through clear plexiglass panels, commanded a perfect field of fire directly aft. The tail gunner, dedicated solely to defending against rear attacks, could bring 2 heavy machine guns to bear on any fighter approaching from 6 o'clock. The dorsal turret could rotate rearward, adding its 2 guns to the defensive barrage. Even the waist gunners could engage targets approaching from behind and slightly below or to the sides. A fighter pilot boring in from directly behind the bomber faced at least 4, sometimes 6, heavy machine guns concentrating fire along a predictable intercept path. The psychological impact of flying into that cone of fire exceeded any calculation. Pilots who survived described it as flying into a wall of tracers, streams of fire that seemed to fill the entire approach corridor. At typical combat ranges of 600 yards, 1 round in every 5 was a tracer, creating visible lines that marked the path of the bullets. The tracers, intended to help gunners adjust their aim by showing bullet trajectory, also provided an immense psychological deterrent. German pilots saw what looked like solid walls of fire converging on their aircraft from multiple bombers simultaneously. Many instinctively broke off attacks before reaching optimal firing position, wasting ammunition on long-range snapshots that had little chance of hitting. The German response came swiftly. By December 1942, Oberleutnant Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II had pioneered a new tactic that exploited what appeared to be the B-17's most vulnerable zone. Instead of attacking from behind, Meyer proposed head-on passes from 12 o'clock, high, diving slightly from above and ahead, firing a concentrated burst at the cockpit and forward fuselage, then breaking away under the bomber before defensive guns could track effectively. The nose of early B-17 models, including the F variant, mounted only 2 or 3 flexible guns operated by the bombardier and navigator, crew members who had other primary duties during combat and weren't dedicated gunners. These flexible guns, mounted in sockets in the plexiglass nose glazing, had limited traverse and required the crew members to move the guns physically from one position to another. The frontal attack doctrine spread rapidly through Luftwaffe fighter units across Germany and occupied Europe. It worked spectacularly when executed properly by skilled pilots with strong nerves. The combined closing speed between attacking fighter and oncoming bomber exceeded 500 miles per hour, with the fighter approaching at 350 to 400 and the bomber flying toward it at 150 to 180. This gave the bomber's nose gunner perhaps 2 seconds to aim and fire before the fighter flashed past. Those 2 seconds demanded extraordinary marksmanship from the defensive gunner, who had to track a rapidly approaching target, estimate lead angle, and fire accurately despite wind blast, vibration, and the psychological pressure of watching a fighter dive directly toward him with guns blazing. The attacking pilot, meanwhile, enjoyed a nearly stationary target growing larger in his gun sight, making aim calculation relatively simple compared to deflection shots against crossing targets. German pilots who mastered the head-on pass achieved impressive results through the winter and spring of 1943, but the tactic demanded exceptional nerve and discipline that not all pilots possessed. Fighter and bomber hurtled toward each other at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, closing the distance at nearly 750 feet per second. The attacking pilot needed to hold his course directly into the bomber's nose, watching it grow from a distant speck to a massive 4-engine aircraft filling his windscreen, waiting until the range closed to point-blank distance of 200 yards or less before firing. Any hesitation, any early breakaway prompted by survival instinct, reduced effectiveness dramatically. Even successful frontal attacks often proved fatal for the German pilot. The combined closing speed meant collision remained a constant danger. Pilots who pressed their attacks too aggressively sometimes couldn't pull out before their fighter struck the bomber. Multiple Luftwaffe fighters collided with B-17s during frontal passes, killing both crews instantly. By early 1943, the strategic situation for Germany had deteriorated significantly. In the east, the disaster at Stalingrad had cost an entire army. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps faced defeat, and over the Reich itself, the American daylight bombing campaign was gathering momentum. Every week brought larger formations, more bombers, deeper penetrations into German territory. Targets that had seemed safely beyond Allied reach, factories in Bavaria and Saxony, now came under attack with increasing frequency. The Luftwaffe fighter force expanded rapidly to meet the threat. During the first half of 1943, the day fighter strength in Germany and the Western occupied territories rose from 635 aircraft to over 800. Fighter units were pulled back from the Eastern and Mediterranean fronts. Every available pilot with combat experience found himself assigned to Reich defense. The best aces, men with 50, 100, even 150 victories, transferred to units defending German industry. But even as fighter strength increased, so did the size of American bomber formations. What had been raids by 50 or 100 B-17s in late 1942 became missions by 200 or 300 bombers by mid-1943. The arithmetic was unfavorable and getting worse. The test flights at Rechlin using the captured B-17, designated with German markings DL+XC and nicknamed Wolfhound by its captors, revealed uncomfortable truths about American defensive philosophy. German test pilot Hans-Werner Lersch flew the bomber extensively through the spring of 1943, conducting simulated attack runs while German fighters made passes from various angles and ranges. Ground observers photographed the engagements. Combat cameramen filmed from chase planes. Every angle of approach was tested, every tactic evaluated. The exercises confirmed what combat reports from frontline units had suggested. The B-17's defensive armament, when properly employed by trained gunners within a tight formation, created a defensive bubble that was extremely difficult to penetrate without taking casualties. Attacking from any angle within effective gun range meant exposing the fighter to concentrated fire from multiple weapons. The interlocking fields of fire meant that no single approach offered a clear path to the target. Every attack angle had coverage from at least 2, usually 3 or 4, gun positions. The waist gunners covered beam attacks. The ball turret dominated the lower hemisphere. The dorsal turret provided coverage above and to the sides. The tail position defended the rear quarter. Even frontal attacks, the most promising tactic, faced increasing defensive fire as American crews adapted. German fighter pilots needed to destroy bombers quickly and completely because wounded B-17s kept flying. The bomber's rugged construction, featuring heavy-gauge aluminum alloy frames and stressed skin that distributed loads efficiently across the entire airframe, allowed it to absorb punishment that would have destroyed equivalent German aircraft. Multiple redundant systems meant single failures rarely proved catastrophic. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires from small-caliber hits, armor plate protected critical crew positions and vital systems. After detailed analysis of fighter attacks on B-17s, German engineers calculated that it took an average of 20 hits with 20mm cannon shells to bring down a fortress attacking from the rear. 20 hits. German fighter pilots in actual combat achieved hit rates around 2%, a figure determined through analysis of gun camera footage and ammunition expenditure reports. Simple mathematics revealed the problem. At 2% accuracy, a pilot needed to fire approximately 1,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition to achieve the 20 hits required for a kill from the rear. Early model Focke-Wulf FW, 190 fighters, carried only 500 rounds, total of 20mm ammunition distributed across 2 cannons. Even upgraded variants with 4 cannons carried only 500 to 600 total rounds. A German fighter pilot might have ammunition for 1, perhaps 2, sustained attack runs before running empty and being forced to break off. Meanwhile, the bombers continued firing as long as they detected threats. Their thousands of rounds of half-inch ammunition allowed prolonged defensive engagement throughout missions that might last 8 hours. While individual bomber gunners achieved relatively low hit percentages due to difficult deflection shooting at extreme ranges, the sheer volume of fire from a formation made hits statistically inevitable. When 20 or 30 bombers concentrated fire on a single attacking fighter, the mathematics shifted decisively in favor of the defenders. The B-17's defensive firepower did not make the bombers invulnerable. Thousands would be shot down over Europe by determined German pilots and accurate anti-aircraft fire. But the defensive armament made them survivable in sufficient numbers to accomplish their mission. Enough bombers got through the defenses to hit their targets. Enough crews survived their tours to return home and train replacement crews. The cumulative effect, over hundreds of missions across 2 years, systematically destroyed Germany's industrial capacity. July 5, 1943, 23,000 feet above the Mediterranean Sea. The 99th Bombardment Group, known as the Diamondbacks, formed up in defensive box formation for a strike against Gerbini airfield on Sicily. 27 B-17 flying fortresses climbed to altitude through brilliant morning light that reflected off their aluminum skin. Intelligence had warned that German and Italian fighter units were concentrated on Sicily in preparation for the Allied invasion scheduled to begin in 5 days. The mission profile called for a bombing run against the main airdrome and support facilities, heavily defended by over 100 enemy fighters, estimated to be within immediate response range. The bombers would have an escort of approximately 60 Supermarine Spitfires from Royal Air Force Malta. But once combat was joined, the defensive formations would have to rely on their own firepower. The rendezvous with the Spitfire escort occurred as briefed, 30 miles north of Valletta. The distinctive elliptical wings of the British fighters took up positions around the bomber formation. Then the formation turned north, crossed the Sicilian coast, and began the final approach to the target. The first indication of enemy contact came over the intercom. Multiple bogies at 12 o'clock high, range approximately 8 miles and closing. Within seconds, the estimate was revised. Not 8 fighters, not 20. More, many more. The sky erupted with German and Italian fighters, a swarm of aircraft that seemed to fill the entire forward hemisphere. Messerschmitt Bf-109S, with their angular lines and inverted Daimler-Benz engines, dove from above in coordinated pairs. The G6 variant featured a single 30mm cannon firing through the propeller spinner and 2 13mm machine guns in the cowling. Focke-Wulf FW190S, powered by massive BMW radial engines, made slashing attacks from the flanks. The A4 and A5 variants carried 2 13mm machine guns in the cowling and 4 20mm cannons in the wings. Italian Macchi C-202 Folgore fighters, elegant and maneuverable, worked in pairs to separate bombers from formation. Intelligence had been conservative. There weren't 100 fighters. There were 130, perhaps 150. A massive concentration of Axis air power scrambled from multiple airfields across Sicily and southern Italy. The Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader 77 and elements of JG-27 were present. The Regia Aeronautica's elite units, including the 4th Stormo and remnants of units that had fought in North Africa, joined the battle. These were not inexperienced pilots. Many were veterans with dozens or hundreds of combat missions. They knew bomber tactics intimately. They understood how defensive formations worked and where the weak points lay. The Spitfire escorts engaged immediately, but they were outnumbered more than 2 to 1. The RAF pilots did what they could, engaging the leading elements and shooting down several fighters in the opening minutes. But they could not prevent the mass of Axis fighters from reaching the bomber formations. The B-17S would have to fight their way through. Across the formation, gunners swung their weapons onto target as fighters flashed through the defensive box. The dorsal turrets rotated, tracking threats from above. Ball turret gunners, cramped in their spherical gun positions beneath the fuselage, called out fighters approaching from below. Waist gunners stood at open windows, where temperatures had plummeted to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. their electrically heated suits barely sufficient against the cold and the hurricane-force wind that screamed through the openings. Tail gunners watched the rear quarter, calling out fighters positioning for stern attacks. The mathematics of defensive fire began to assert itself. Each bomber in the formation could bring multiple guns to bear on attacking fighters, depending on the approach angle. A fighter making a beam attack from 3 o'clock faced fire from both waist guns, the ball turret if the angle was slightly low, and the dorsal turret. A fighter attacking from 6 o'clock faced the tail guns, possibly the dorsal turret, and the waist guns. The combined fire from 27 bombers created zones where attacking pilots faced dozens of machine guns simultaneously. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. German and Italian pilots pressing their attacks described flying into walls of fire. Tracer rounds, loaded every 5th round in American ammunition belts, drew visible lines across the sky. From the attacking pilot's perspective, these tracers appeared to converge directly on his aircraft. The visual effect was overwhelming. Even when actual bullets missed by comfortable margins, the tracers created the impression of flying into an impenetrable barrier. Many pilots broke off attacks prematurely, firing from extreme range where hit probability approached 0, then diving away before defensive fire could find them. But some pilots pressed on, the determined ones, the veterans who had learned to suppress survival instinct long enough to close to point-blank range, achieved results. B-17s shuddered as cannon shells walked across wings and fuselage. One bomber, struck in the fuel tanks, exploded in a brilliant fireball. Pieces tumbled through the formation. Another, with 2 engines trailing smoke, fell away from the defensive box, immediately swarmed by fighters sensing easy prey. A third, its nose section shattered by 30mm shells, nosed over sharply and plunged toward the sea far below. But the bombers that remained in formation continued to pour fire into the attackers. The defensive guns hammered continuously. Spent brass casings littered the floors of gun positions. Ammunition cans emptied. Gunners reloaded while their partners covered their sectors. The smell of cordite filled the aircraft. Gun barrels glowed red-hot from sustained firing. And fighters began falling. A Messerschmitt, struck by converging fire from 3 bombers, disintegrated in mid-air. Another, smoke pouring from its engine, rolled inverted and fell away in a flat spin. A Focke-Wulf, its cockpit shattered by half-inch rounds, pitched up violently, stalled, and tumbled toward the ground. An Italian Macchi, trailing flames, pulled up hard, the pilot bailing out, his parachute blossoming white against the blue sky. The bomber gunners, many of them on their first or second combat mission, were proving that training and formation discipline could make defensive gunnery effective despite the extreme difficulties. They had learned to fire in short, controlled bursts rather than holding the trigger down. They led their targets, calculating deflection angles instinctively through countless hours of practice. They waited for optimal range instead of wasting ammunition at distances where hits were impossible. And most importantly, they maintained formation integrity, knowing that mutual support was the key to survival. The bombardier's voice cut through the chaos on the intercom. Bomb bay doors open, approaching release point. The formation steadied on its final approach, flying straight and level despite the fighters swarming around them. The pilots held their aircraft rock steady despite cannon fire walking across their wings. This was the most vulnerable moment of any mission, when evasive maneuvers were impossible and the bombers flew predictable paths that German gunners could anticipate. Then, bombs away. The aircraft lifted suddenly as thousands of pounds of high explosive fell free. Through the open bomb bay doors, gunners could see the bombs tumbling downward in sequence from aircraft across the formation. Hundreds of bombs plunging toward Gerbini. The formation began its turn toward home. But the fighters weren't finished. They pressed their attacks all the way to the coast, pilots burning their remaining ammunition in desperate attempts to bring down bombers before the formation escaped over water. The defensive guns continued firing. More fighters fell. More bombers took damage. The sky filled with smoke and falling aircraft, both American and Axis, both victors and vanquished in a battle where victory was measured in survival rather than glory. When the 99th Bombardment Group crossed the Sicilian coast and headed south over the Mediterranean, 24 of the 27 bombers that had started the mission remained airborne. 3 had been shot down, 30 men killed or captured. Many of the survivors bore terrible scars: flak holes, cannon strikes, shattered plexiglass, hydraulic systems leaking, engines damaged. One bomber landed with over 100 holes in its airframe, but 24 had returned. In the mathematics of strategic bombing that counted as success, the post-mission debriefing revealed something remarkable. The gunners claimed 35 enemy aircraft destroyed. Post-war analysis, comparing American claims against German loss records, would eventually reduce this figure to approximately 18 confirmed kills, typical of aerial combat where multiple gunners fired at the same targets and overclaiming was inevitable. But even 18 fighters destroyed by defensive fire from a single bomb group in one mission was extraordinary. It represented nearly 12% of the attacking force, losses that no air force could sustain indefinitely. The mission reports circulated rapidly through 8th Air Force and 12th Air Force intelligence channels. Every fighter unit needed to understand what had happened over Gerbini. The analysis was clear. Properly trained gunners, firing from properly positioned aircraft in tight defensive formations, could inflict catastrophic losses on attacking fighters. The B-17's defensive armament was not theoretical firepower measured in guns per aircraft. It was practical firepower measured in enemy fighters destroyed, missions completed, crews returned home. Within weeks, the lessons learned over Sicily would be incorporated into training curricula across all American heavy bomber units. Emphasis shifted from volume of fire to accuracy. New training exercises focused on deflection, shooting, and target tracking. Gun camera footage was analyzed to determine optimal engagement ranges and lead angles. The message was consistent across all training commands. The defensive box formation worked. Formation integrity was paramount. Accurate fire from properly positioned guns could defeat fighter attacks despite numerical disadvantage. The B-17's defensive firepower, when properly employed, was sufficient to accomplish the strategic bombing mission. But the real test would come over Germany itself, where the Luftwaffe fighter force was strongest, where defenses were deepest, where every mission would be contested with a ferocity that made Sicily seem like a training exercise. The bombers would face not 150 fighters, but 300 or more. They would fly not to Sicily, a relatively short mission with fighter escort available, but deep into the Reich, to targets 400 or 500 miles, inside Germany, where no escort fighters could reach. They would attack ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, aircraft factories at Regensburg, oil refineries across Silesia, submarine pens on the Atlantic coast, and they would do it without fighter escort for most of the mission, relying solely on their defensive firepower for hours at a time, while German fighters swarmed like angry hornets. August 17, 1943, 08, 35 inches the morning, Eastern England. The fog that had blanketed the airfields began to lift as 376 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses started their engines for what would become one of the most ambitious operations in the history of strategic bombing. The mission planners called it Operation Juggler, though the crews would remember it by the names of its targets, Schweinfurt and Regensburg. 2 forces, 2 targets, 1 coordinated strike designed to cripple German fighter production at its source. The 4th Bombardment Wing, 146 aircraft under the command of Colonel Curtis LeMay, would strike the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, then continue south to land in North Africa, avoiding the deadly gauntlet of fighters waiting for their return. The 1st Bombardment Wing, 230 bombers under Brigadier General Robert Williams, would attack the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, then fight their way back to England through the full fury of the Luftwaffe. The weather had already disrupted the carefully coordinated timing. The Regensburg force took off on schedule, but the Schweinfurt bombers remained grounded by fog for several hours, giving German fighter controllers time they desperately needed to land, refuel, and rearm their aircraft between attacks. When the Regensburg force crossed the Dutch coast shortly after 9 in the morning, German radar stations tracked their progress with precision. Fighter units across western Germany scrambled. The Luftwaffe had been waiting for exactly this kind of deep penetration mission, an opportunity to inflict casualties that might force the Americans to reconsider their entire daylight bombing strategy. Over 300 fighters rose to meet the bombers, the largest concentration of German air power assembled against a single American raid to that point in the war. Messerschmitt Bf-109s from multiple Jagdgeschwader formed up in swarms, the 4 aircraft tactical formations that allowed coordinated attacks from multiple angles simultaneously. Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, some equipped with additional armor plating and heavier cannon for bomber destruction, positioned themselves for the assault. Twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s, armed with 21-centimeter rockets, prepared to launch their devastating munitions from beyond the effective range of defensive guns. The American formation flew in the standard combat box configuration, squadrons stacked vertically and offset horizontally to maximize overlapping fields of fire. Each bomber maintained precise position relative to its neighbors, close enough that their defensive guns could support each other, far enough that collision was unlikely during evasive maneuvers. The pilots flew with instruments constantly scanning, holding formation through turbulence and flak, trusting that discipline would see them through. The first attacks came as the formation approached Frankfurt. Fighters dove from above in coordinated pairs, the lead aircraft absorbing defensive fire, while the wingman followed seconds later, attacking bombers whose gunners were reloading or tracking the first attacker. The tactic worked. B-17s shuddered under cannon fire. Some fell away trailing smoke, others exploded when fuel tanks ignited. But the bombers that remained in formation fought back with concentrated fire that began taking its toll on the attackers. A Focke-Wulf, hit in the engine by converging fire from 3 bombers, disintegrated in a shower of flaming debris. A Messerschmitt, its pilot killed by a burst through the canopy, rolled inverted and plunged earthward. Another, smoke pouring from punctured fuel tanks, pulled up sharply, the pilot bailing out at the last moment. The defensive guns hammered continuously. Waist gunners stood in the freezing wind, their breath frosting instantly in the -40-degree air, swinging their heavy weapons to track targets approaching at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Ball turret gunners, cramped in positions too small for parachutes, rotated their spheres to engage fighters attacking from below. Tail gunners called out threats from behind, their twin 50s pouring fire into the approach corridor. The Germans adapted their tactics in real time. Seeing that stern attacks were producing unacceptable losses, experienced pilots shifted to head-on passes, diving from 12 o'clock high, firing brief concentrated bursts, then breaking away before defensive fire could track them. This tactic proved more effective, exploiting the B-17F's relatively weak nose armament. Bombers at the front of the formation took terrible punishment. Lead aircraft, which bore the brunt of head-on attacks, suffered casualties among pilots and bombardiers at rates that exceeded other positions. Some bombers, their cockpits shattered by 30mm cannon fire, fell away immediately. Others, wounded but still flying, continued toward the target despite dead or incapacitated pilots, the co-pilots wrestling damaged aircraft through the formation. But even the head-on attacks exacted a price. German pilots pressing their passes had to hold their courses directly into the bomber's nose, watching the fortress grow in their windscreens, waiting for point-blank range before firing. The closing speed of over 500 miles per hour meant split-second timing was required. Fire too early and the rounds dispersed without effect. Wait too long and collision became inevitable. Several German fighters, their pilots fixated on their targets or killed by defensive fire, slammed into the bombers they were attacking, destroying both aircraft in violent collisions that sent debris tumbling through the formation. The Regensburg force fought its way across southern Germany for over 3 hours, harried by fighters every mile of the way. The Germans had never mounted such a sustained assault. As soon as one group exhausted its ammunition and broke off, another appeared to continue the attack. The bomber crews, many on their first or second combat missions, fought with a desperation born of understanding that survival depended entirely on maintaining formation and keeping their guns firing. Some aircraft absorbed damage that should have been fatal but continued flying through sheer structural integrity. Wings holed by cannon fire, fuselages riddled with machine gun strikes, engines trailing smoke or completely destroyed, hydraulic systems leaking, control cables severed, crew members wounded or dead. Yet still the fortresses flew on, held together by rivets and determination and the skill of pilots, who refused to abandon formation even when their aircraft was dying around them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Over the target at Regensburg, the bombers steadied for their run. Anti-aircraft fire erupted around them, adding to the chaos. Black puffs of smoke filled the sky, each burst sending shrapnel through the formation. The Norden bomb sites calculated release points with mechanical precision, while bombardiers made final adjustments for wind and altitude. Then, bombs away. Thousands of pounds of high explosive tumbled toward the Messerschmitt factory below. Photo reconnaissance aircraft following the strike would later confirm significant damage to assembly halls, machine shops, and supply facilities. But the cost had been terrible. As the formation turned south toward the Alps and the comparative safety of North Africa beyond, the survivors counted their losses. 24 B-17s had been shot down or damaged so severely they would never reach Africa. Over 200 men were gone, killed in action or captured after bailing out over enemy territory. Some bombers ditched in the Mediterranean after crossing the Alps, their fuel exhausted or engines too damaged to continue. Others crash-landed in North Africa, their landing gear shot away or hydraulics destroyed. The Schweinfurt force, delayed by fog over England, encountered the same German fighter units after they had landed, rearmed, and refueled. The Luftwaffe had learned from the morning engagement. They concentrated their attacks, throwing everything available against the formation. Over 300 fighters swarmed the bombers as they crossed into Germany. The head-on attacks came in waves, timed to maximize disruption of the formation. Pairs of fighters dove from ahead, firing, breaking away, then circling back for another pass, while other pairs continued the assault. The defensive fire from bombers created a hellish display. Dozens of machine guns firing simultaneously, traces drawing lines across the sky, shells converging on attacking fighters from multiple bombers. The volume of fire was staggering, measured in thousands of rounds per minute across the entire formation. German pilots described it as flying into a storm of steel, a visual metaphor that captured both the physical danger and psychological impact of massed defensive fire. Yet they pressed their attacks with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. This was their homeland being bombed. These factories produced the bearings that kept German industry functioning. The mission had to be stopped, regardless of cost, and the cost mounted on both sides. B-17s fell from formation, some tumbling in pieces after direct hits, others spiraling downward with one or two engines still running, pilots fighting damaged controls all the way to the ground. Some exploded when bombs still in their bays were struck by cannon fire. Others burned, the crews bailing out as flames consumed their aircraft. But German fighters fell too. The defensive fire, concentrated by the formation's discipline, found targets with increasing frequency. A Messerschmitt, struck in the fuel system, exploded in a fireball visible for miles. A Fokker-Wulf, its pilot wounded by a burst from a top turret, pulled up sharply, stalled, and entered an irrecoverable spin. A twin-engine Bf-110, attempting to launch rockets from standoff range, was caught by converging fire from half a dozen bombers, its wings shearing off, the aircraft tumbling earthward. The running battle continued all the way to the target and all the way back. German pilots made multiple sorties, landing to rearm and immediately taking off again to rejoin the assault. Some pilots flew 3 or 4 missions that day, attacking the bombers on their way in and again on their way out. The exhaustion showed in declining effectiveness as the day wore on, but their determination never wavered. Over Schweinfurt, through thick anti-aircraft fire, the bombers released their loads. The ball-bearing plants below erupted in explosions as hundreds of bombs found their marks. Assembly buildings collapsed, storage facilities burned, rail lines were cratered, but the formation paid a terrible price for the achievement. As the bombers turned for home, the fighters resumed their attacks with renewed intensity. The running battle back to the English Channel lasted over 2 hours. More bombers fell, more crew members died. The survivors watched their formation grow smaller with each passing mile. Some aircraft, too damaged to maintain formation speed, fell behind and were immediately set upon by German fighters who had learned that stragglers were easy prey. A crippled bomber without the concentrated defensive fire of the formation lasted minutes at best against determined attack. When the last survivors limped back to England that afternoon, the accounting was devastating. 36 B-17s lost from the Schweinfurt force. Combined with the Regensburg losses, 60 heavy bombers destroyed in a single day. Nearly 600 men killed, wounded, or captured. The loss rate approached 16%, unsustainable by any calculation. If the 8th Air Force continued suffering such casualties, they would lose their entire bomber force within a few months. The mission had achieved its objectives, inflicting significant damage on critical German industries. But the cost forced a fundamental reassessment of American bombing strategy. The B-17, for all its armor and defensive firepower, could not continue flying unescorted deep into Germany against swarms of fighters and sophisticated air defense systems. Something had to change. The answer would not come from improved bomber design or better defensive tactics. It would come from long-range escort fighters capable of accompanying the bombers all the way to target and back, engaging German fighters before they could close, to effective range of the bomber formations. But those escort fighters, the P-51 Mustangs that would eventually win air superiority over Europe, were still months away from operational deployment in sufficient numbers. In the interim, the bombers would continue flying, and the defensive guns would continue firing, and men would continue dying over Europe in a war of attrition that favoured neither side but could not be avoided by either. October 14th, 1943, Black Thursday. The second Schweinfurt mission confirmed what the August raid had suggested. Without adequate fighter escort, deep penetration missions against heavily defended targets produced unacceptable casualties. Of 291 B-17s dispatched, 60 were shot down and another 17 were damaged beyond repair. The loss rate exceeded 20%, a catastrophic figure that could not be sustained. The 8th Air Force suspended deep raids pending the arrival of long-range escorts. The hiatus lasted until February 1944, 5 months during which bomber crews trained, new groups arrived from the United States, and most critically, P-51 Mustangs, equipped with drop tanks, began reaching operational squadrons in numbers sufficient to make a difference. But the statistics from those terrible autumn missions told another story, one that German fighter pilots understood with growing concern. The bombers had shot down between 15 and 20 German fighters per mission, sometimes more. These were not overclaims, inflated by multiple gunners firing at the same target. Post-war analysis comparing American claims against Luftwaffe loss records confirmed that bomber defensive fire was inflicting significant casualties on the attacking force. The mathematics of attrition worked both ways. If the Americans lost 60 bombers in a mission, they could replace those losses within a week. Boeing's Seattle plant alone built over 360 B-17s per month at peak production, more than 12 per day. Douglas and Vega added hundreds more. The entire B-17 force lost in the 2 Schweinfurt raids could be replaced in less than a month. But German fighter production could not match American heavy bomber production, and more critically, German pilot training could not replace experienced aviators at the rate combat was destroying them. Every ace lost to bomber defensive fire represented thousands of hours of combat experience that could not be replicated through training programs. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was significant and growing. Hans Philipp, one of the Luftwaffe's great Experten with over 200 victories accumulated on the Eastern and Western fronts, returned to Germany in late 1943 to take command of Jagdgeschwader 1. In a letter to a former comrade, he described the crushing reality of facing American bomber streams. Against 20 Russians trying to shoot you down, or even 20 Spitfires, it can be exciting, even fun, but curve in towards 40 fortresses, and all your past sins flash before your eyes. 4 days after writing that letter, Philip was dead, shot down during an attack on B-17s, his first and only 4-engine bomber kill, achieved moments before his death. The fear was not unfounded. Attacking a formation of B-17s required flying into concentrated defensive fire from dozens of machine guns simultaneously. Even the most skilled pilots understood that every attack brought them closer to the statistical inevitability of taking a fatal hit. The mathematics was brutal and inescapable. Defensive gunners only needed to get lucky once. Fighter pilots needed to get lucky every time. By early 1944, the arrival of P-51 Mustangs in force fundamentally changed the equation. The long-range escorts could accompany bomber formations all the way to Berlin and back, engaging German fighters before they could close to attack range of the bombers. The P-51's performance matched or exceeded the best German fighters across most flight regimes. More importantly, the Mustangs were available in numbers that allowed them to sweep ahead of the bomber formations, clearing German fighters from entire sectors before the B-17s arrived. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Bomber loss rates dropped from over 10% in late 1943 to below 5% by spring 1944, then below 3% by summer. The defensive guns still fired, still destroyed attacking fighters that broke through the escort screen, but increasingly, their role shifted from primary defense to backup deterrent. The escorts did the heavy lifting, engaging German fighters at distance and altitude where the bomber guns could not reach. Yet the period from August 1943 to February 1944, when the bombers flew unescorted through the deadliest skies in Europe, demonstrated conclusively that the B-17's defensive firepower, properly employed within tight formations, was sufficient to accomplish strategic missions despite horrific casualties. The bomber gunners who manned those defensive positions during the unescorted missions deserve recognition equal to the fighter pilots who later provided escort. They stood at open windows where temperatures dropped to 50 degrees below zero. They operated heavy machine guns while wearing bulky flight suits, oxygen masks, and electrically heated clothing that often failed. They tracked targets approaching at speeds that gave them seconds to react. They did this while wounded crew members called for aid, while engines failed, while flak burst around them, while fighters attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, while their own aircraft maneuvered violently, while the fear of death pressed on them with every mission. And they did it well enough to destroy hundreds of German fighters, well enough to protect their formations, well enough to return home in sufficient numbers to continue the campaign. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner's 7 victories over Gerbeny in July 1943 represented the exceptional achievement, but thousands of other gunners scored 1 or 2 or 3 kills during their tours. Technical Sergeant Michael Aruth destroyed 17 enemy aircraft as a tail gunner with the 379th Bombardment Group, the highest confirmed score by any bomber gunner in Air Force history. Staff Sergeant Arthur Benko shot down 16. Staff Sergeant Donald Crossley achieved 12 confirmed victories. These men displayed marksmanship and courage that equaled or exceeded many fighter aces, yet they received far less recognition. The reasons were partly institutional. The Army Air Forces wanted to promote the bomber offensive as a team effort, with each crew member contributing to mission success rather than seeking individual glory. There was also the practical consideration that confirming bomber-gunner kills was extremely difficult. Multiple guns firing at the same target made attribution nearly impossible. Gun cameras were rare on bombers. Witnesses were often occupied with their own survival. As a result, many gunner victories went unrecorded or unconfirmed. But the impact of defensive fire on German fighter effectiveness was undeniable and well documented in Luftwaffe records. Fighter units that had operated effectively against British bombers found themselves taking unacceptable casualties when attacking American formations. The concentrated defensive fire, the tight formations, the overlapping fields of fire, all combined to create a level of danger that fundamentally changed German tactics. By late 1943, Luftwaffe fighter units were experimenting with standoff weapons, trying to find ways to destroy bombers without closing to within range of the defensive guns. The 21-centimeter Werfer granite rocket became a favored weapon, launched from tubular launchers mounted under fighter wings. These unguided projectiles carried large, high-explosive warheads designed to break up bomber formations through blast effect, rather than achieve direct hits. Actual hit probability remained low due to poor ballistic characteristics, but a rocket exploding in the midst of a combat box could damage multiple bombers simultaneously or cause collisions, as pilots took violent evasive action. But standoff attacks carried their own problems. The rockets were inaccurate beyond 800 yards, heavy enough to significantly reduce fighter performance, and created substantial drag that made launching aircraft vulnerable to American escort fighters. Pilots carrying underwing rocket tubes became easy targets for P-51S and P-47S, which by 1944 could accompany bomber formations deep into Germany. By mid-1944, German experiments with heavier armament had progressed to 30mm Mk108 cannons mounted in wings or underwing pods. These weapons could destroy bombers with just a few hits, their explosive shells tearing massive holes in airframes. But the heavier cannon reduced fighter performance and range, and more critically, required pilots to close to within 400 yards for effective fire. That meant penetrating the defensive gun envelope where concentrated fire from multiple bombers made survival a matter of luck as much as skill. The technological race continued through 1944 as both sides sought advantages. The Americans introduced the B-17G model with a chin turret mounting 250s that could engage targets directly ahead, eliminating the defensive weakness that had made head-on attacks so effective against earlier models. Suddenly, the frontal approach, which had been the preferred tactic of German aces, became far more dangerous. The chin turret, remotely operated by the bombardier, could track an attacking fighter throughout its approach, concentrating fire along the predicted intercept path. Combined with improved cheek guns and the top turret, a B-17G could bring 6 to 8 heavy machine guns to bear on a frontal attacker. This forced the Luftwaffe to adapt once again, searching for new tactical solutions to the evolving defensive problem. Some units experimented with high-angle attacks, diving from above at steep angles where bomber guns had limited elevation. Others tried attacks from below the nose, hoping to stay under the chin turret's depression limits. Still, others resorted to desperate measures, including experimental tactics where fighters attempted to drop bombs onto bomber formations from above, or even ramming attacks by pilots willing to sacrifice themselves to destroy a bomber. But no amount of tactical innovation could compensate for the fundamental arithmetic of industrial production that determined strategic outcomes in modern warfare. The United States built 12,731 B-17 bombers between 1935 and 1945, with the overwhelming majority produced during the peak war years of 1943 and 1944. Boeing's Seattle plant alone constructed 6,981 fortresses. Douglas added 3,000 from Long Beach. Vega contributed 2,750 from Burbank. At peak production in 1944, Boeing built approximately 362 B-17s per month, more than 12 per day from a single facility. German four-engine bomber production never approached these figures. The Heinkel He 177, Germany's only operational four-engine heavy bomber, suffered from chronic engine fires and mechanical problems. Total production barely exceeded 1,100 aircraft between 1942 and 1945, and operational availability remained so poor that many units refused to accept the type. Germany simply could not match American heavy bomber production in either quantity or quality, a failure rooted in strategic decisions, industrial organization, and resource limitations that no amount of technical innovation could overcome. When Wehrmacht officers examined the captured B-17 at Rechlin in October 1942, they recognized the threat it represented. Adolf Galland's assessment was accurate. The bomber united every advantage: heavy armor, enormous altitude capability, colossal defensive armament, great speed, But Galland and his colleagues could not have fully grasped what those advantages meant when multiplied across thousands of aircraft, produced at rates that seemed impossible, flown by crews who kept coming despite horrific casualties, supported by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The B-17's defensive firepower was not a single bomber carrying 9 or 13 machine guns. It was formations of hundreds of bombers, each supporting the others, creating defensive bubbles that concentrated dozens or hundreds of guns on attacking fighters. It was trained gunners who had practiced deflection shooting until it became instinct. It was formation discipline that maintained position despite fear and casualties. It was the understanding that survival depended on mutual support and accurate fire. The defensive armament proved sufficient for the baited boast strategic bombing mission, not because it made the bombers invulnerable, but because it made them survivable in the numbers required to accomplish objectives. The losses were terrible. Over 4,700 B-17s were destroyed in combat or operational accidents during the war. Tens of thousands of crew members died. The casualty rates among bomber crews exceeded 30% in some units during the worst periods of 1943. Young men in their early 20s faced mortality rates that rivaled or exceeded infantry in major ground battles. Yet they continued to fly, mission after mission, because the strategic importance of the bombing campaign demanded it, and because the defensive firepower gave them a fighting chance of survival. By 1945, when the last missions were flown over a defeated Germany, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved its objectives. German industry lay in ruins. Fuel production had collapsed. Transportation networks were destroyed. The Luftwaffe, once the most formidable air force in the world, had been ground down through attrition until it could no longer effectively contest Allied air supremacy. The B-17 Flying Fortress and its defensive armament had played a central role in that achievement. The 12 or 1350 caliber machine guns bristling from its fuselage had destroyed hundreds of German fighters, protected thousands of bomber crews, and enabled the delivery of hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on strategic targets across occupied Europe and Germany itself. Wehrmacht officers who had initially dismissed the threat, who had believed German fighter pilots could defeat unescorted bomber formations through superior tactics and skill, learned the terrible lesson that industrial capacity and defensive firepower could overcome individual excellence when deployed at sufficient scale. The mathematics of strategic bombing proved inescapable. The bombers kept coming, the defensive guns kept firing, and eventually, inevitably, Germany's capacity to resist was broken not by any single raid or battle, but by the cumulative weight of 2 years of sustained attack. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.